Rudy Eugene was born at the Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, Florida on February 4th, 1981. His parents emigrated from Nigeria but were divorced shortly after his birth, and Eugene's father sadly died when he was just 6 years old, so growing up he had no true paternal figure in his life. Rudy was a student at North Miami Beach High School. In the 10th and 11th grades, he exceeded academically, but was focused and healthy enough to earn a place on its football team in the late 90s. After his graduation ceremony, Rudy earned a meager living from such sources as selling CDs and jobs at McDonald's, before landing a more stable and well-paying job in telemarketing. However, his last known employment was washing cars at a local automobile dealership, a sign of the deterioration that marred his later years. However, despite his run of bad luck, Rudy had expressed interest in establishing his own mobile car wash business. Every Sunday during his boyhood, Rudy accompanied his family to the Bethel Evangelical Baptist Church. His mother had hoped that, since there was no fatherly role model in his life, that religion might fill the void in Rudy's moral landscape. And for a while, it worked. But that moral stability was not to last. By the age of just 16 years old, Rudy had been arrested a total of 8 times for offenses ranging from possession of marijuana to assault. At one point, he was even taken into police custody for a domestic abuse incident involving his own mother. He had smashed a table, destroyed household items, and even laid hands on his mother, shoving her around and telling her, "I'll put a gun to your head and kill you." The incident at home led to him serving an extended probation for resisting an officer without violence. Despite the instability of his early years, Rudy managed to get married in 2005, marrying his longtime girlfriend before the pair moved in together. However, the marriage only lasted 3 years before a series of domestic abuse caused his wife to file for divorce in late 2007, one that was eventually granted on January 8, 2008. His wife had cited his abusive and violent nature and told a judge that it was the reason she had been so reluctant to commit to having children with him, having refused the suggestion multiple times before she could find it in herself to divorce him. The pair never reconciled, nor did they stay in touch, and remained estranged right up to the incident that became nationwide news and put Rudy's face on the TV screens of Americans everywhere for some incredibly disturbing reasons. Rudy was 31 years old in May of 2012 when he drove down to Miami Beach to participate in Urban Beach Week. He was driving a purple Chevrolet Caprice, which began to break down at some point, at which time he pulled over to the side of the road. According to footage taken from security cameras, Rudy spent 30 to 40 minutes attempting ineffective repairs before he eventually abandoned the vehicle around noon. It's then that Rudy's behavior takes a bizarre turn. He begins to move west, crossing the 3-mile length of MacArthur Causeway, tossing away his driver's license before beginning to take his clothes off. Multiple eyewitnesses saw him doing this, but naturally were disturbed by his weird behavior that they didn't attempt any kind of confrontation. Miami Beach police officers eventually discovered the abandoned Caprice. Although they were confused by its presence at the side of the road and the absence of a driver, they didn't treat the incident as particularly suspicious and simply towed the vehicle to a local impound lot. Inside the car, officers found that there was a Bible, along with 5 empty water bottles, with a receipt that made it clear that they had been bought earlier that day. Whatever Rudy Eugene was doing, it sure made for thirsty work. By the time that the cops had impounded Rudy's car, Rudy Eugene was walking around southern Florida in the early afternoon completely naked. He'd even taken off and thrown away his shoes and socks and was seemingly unbothered by the discomfort of walking around the hot roads and gravelly side roads in his completely bare feet. Then, around 1:55 p.m., Rudy bumped into Ronald Popo, a 65-year-old homeless man who had been lying beneath the elevated Metro Mover People Mover viaduct near the headquarters of the Miami Herald in the Arts and Entertainment District neighborhood of downtown Miami. Ronald was raised in Brooklyn, New York, where he actually attended Manhattan's esteemed Stuyvesant High School. After he graduated, Ronald enrolled at the nearby City College, but dropped out in 1966 before becoming part of the burgeoning hippie movement, officially becoming homeless in the mid-70s. Just days prior to meeting Rudy Eugene, Ronald had been offered assistance by the Miami-Dade County Homeless Trust, but he had refused. It seems he was something of a free spirit, proud of being self-reliant and unwilling to submit himself to the mercies of the local government. Ronald must have been extremely surprised to see a completely naked man approaching him, but there could have been no possible way he could have foreseen what was about to happen. Ronald made eye contact with Rudy, greeting him nervously. Then, out of nowhere, Rudy accused him of stealing his Bible. Ronald denied doing so in utter confusion, but Rudy went on a rant about how it didn't matter and that they were both going to die. Then, without another word, Rudy began to brutally attack the elderly homeless man without so much as an ounce of provocation. He beat him mercilessly, then bizarrely began to try to strip Ronald of his pants, who became terrified that the naked man's intentions were to indecently assault him, when in reality, the direction the attack would take was far, far worse. In the middle of the attack, Rudy Eugene mounted Ronald Popo, pinned him to the ground, and began to bite his face. He locked his teeth into the man's flesh and began to rip and tear over and over again, pulling off chunks of flesh and spitting them out, using his teeth as pure offensive weaponry. A man named Larry Vega, who happened to be riding a bicycle near to the scene, was horrified when he saw the attack unfolding and immediately called 911. The phone call was so frantic and terrifying that it only took a matter of minutes for Miami PD officer Jose Ramirez to arrive on the scene. What greeted him was like something out of a zombie horror movie. A man cannibalizing another man's face, blood pouring from both the victim's head and the mouth of the wild-eyed, stark-naked aggressor. Officer Ramirez pulled out his service pistol, aimed it towards Rudy Eugene, and screamed at him to show him his hands. Eugene turned, blood soaked his face. His eyes filled with rage and madness, and actually growled at the police officer before resuming his attack on the already savaged Popo. Then at 2:13 p.m., Officer Ramirez fired his first shot at Rudy Eugene, who shockingly enough barely reacted to the 9mm bullet penetrating his body. He actually carried on biting Ronald Popo, tearing at his flesh and continuing to growl until the police officer fired 4 more shots, killing Eugene and ending the vicious assault. Ronald Popo then was rushed to the nearby Jackson Memorial Hospital in a horrendously serious, life-threatening condition. In his interviews with police following the attack, Popo thanked Officer Ramirez personally for saving his life. It was reported afterward that around 80% of the facial flesh above his beard was missing, and that his left eye had been gouged out and eaten by his rabid attacker. Popo lost his eyebrows, his nose, parts of his forehead and cheek. Doctors undertook hours upon hours of highly advanced facial reconstruction surgeries over the course of 3 months, but they couldn't save Ronald's eyesight, and he remained permanently disfigured. His plight reached social media, and a crowdfund was set up that since raised over $100,000 to help with surgery costs and other expenses. As a result, he was granted permission to stay at the medical facility indefinitely. Following his intensive course of rehabilitation, Ronald put on 50 pounds of weight and had to relearn how to dress, feed himself, shower, and shave as a result of such extensive and permanent wounds. At the time of the attack, Popo's family, including his daughter, had not heard from him in over 30 years. During that time, they assumed that Ronald was dead, strongly suspecting that he had ended his own life due to his past troubles with depression and substance abuse. They actually discovered he was still alive as a result of the attack, and naturally the whole thing came as a huge shock to them. Popo has since completed treatment and was last residing in a Medicaid facility. He received nutritional and occupational therapy and took up learning the guitar as a way to cope with the trauma of the incident. As for Rudy Eugene, the reasons for his behavior have remained shrouded in mystery. Despite the autopsy on his body revealing no human flesh in his stomach, a number of undigested pills were discovered that pathologists were completely unable to identify. Although spokespeople for law enforcement had released statements saying that the street drug bath salts might have been to blame for Eugene's behavior, initial toxicology reports showed that there was only the presence of cannabis in his bloodstream. However, investigators didn't necessarily find the negative results entirely conclusive. Broward County Sheriff Al Lamberti told reporters that he believed that some new and unknown narcotic was to blame, one that had proved impossible to test for and was therefore undetectable. However, renowned toxicologist Barry Logan said that Rudy's behavior was entirely consistent with bath salts, and it was completely unfeasible to test for every drug under the sun. This was backed up by Dr. Bruce Goldberger of the University of Florida, who said, "We are not incompetent. We have the tools. We have the sophistication and know-how. But the field is evolving so rapidly it is hard for us to keep track. It's almost as if it is a race we can never win." Regardless of the reasons behind Rudy Eugene's savage, inhuman attack on Ronald Popo, the incident has since passed into Florida folklore, often being referred to in such ways as the Miami Cannibal or the Florida Face Eater. It is without a doubt one of the most harrowing real-life incidents of our time, a testament to the destructiveness of drugs and mental illness, and I'm sure it's something none of you will forget for quite some time. So I live with my mom and dad here in Escambia County here in Florida. One evening, me and my mom were just sitting around watching TV when we heard some shouting coming from the street outside. At first, my mom just shakes her head and makes some comment about the neighbors being noisy again, and we just carry on watching our show. But as the shouting gets louder and we start to hear this revving engine sound, she turns down the TV a little and we start to listen into what it was. It sounded like shouting was coming from the right outside of her house by that point, and so I got up to take a peek around the TV room curtains to see what it was. In the street outside is a kid in his underwear who's just facing down a truck. He's shouting at the driver, who's shouting back, and from what I could make out, the argument is over the truck driver wanting the kid to do something and the kid refusing. I could tell from the way the kid was addressing the driver that it was some kind of family argument, a gut feeling that was confirmed when the kid eventually called the driver Dad at one point. The argument peaks in intensity at one point, and the two people were just screaming at each other with the driver kind of leaning out of the driver's side window, when all of a sudden the driver leans in, revs the truck engine, and legit tries to run the kid over in the middle of the street. Luckily, the kid reacted just in time, dodging the truck and running into one of our neighbor's front yards as it sped past him. My mom, who was also watching by that point, gasped like, "Oh my God," and we watch as the truck does a U-turn in the street, preparing to make another pass on the kid. But the kid isn't about to let that happen and runs across some yards in the direction of our house, banging on the front door and screaming for help. We just reacted, running to the front door and letting the kid inside as the truck screamed past again, the driver shouting out the window as it came to a stop. We slam the door closed and my mom runs to call the cops as I try to comfort the kid, even though he's basically in his underwear and I'm in no mood to be hugging a half-naked teenager no matter how panicked he is. The kid's dad starts banging on our front door now, shouting about how he knew his son was in there and for him to come out so he could face the music or whatever. Trying to ignore all the commotion, I remember asking what had happened to cause such an intense family argument, and you will seriously not believe what the kid said next. He tells me straight up that, basically, no matter how much his dad wants him to, he will not take a bath. He keeps ranting about how he's a grown-up and he can do what he wants, and he won't just do what people tell him to do, how he's perfectly capable of looking after himself and he doesn't need anyone to keep tabs on his personal hygiene. It's only then that I start to notice just how bad this kid smells, how his breath smelled so bad and his skin was all greasy looking. He obviously hadn't bathed in quite a while, and although there's obviously no excuse for trying to run someone over for something like that, I started to understand with his dad having gotten so frustrated. Now this whole time the dad is banging on the door, saying he's not going to leave until his son comes out, but my mom had come back to tell us that the cops were on the way and that everything was going to be okay. But as she's talking to the kid, she had pretty much the same reaction as me, and there's a moment where she stops talking for a second and her nostrils flare from where she started to get an idea of how bad the kid smelled too. And again, with the same air of indignation, the kid tells my mom that No one's going to be the one to tell him to take a bath. How he's a grown man, obviously he was not, and how he can make his own decisions. My mom's face when he was telling her this was just a picture, like mine. She could literally not believe what she was hearing, nor could she believe the kind of situation we had gotten ourselves into. Eventually, the cops showed up and tried to talk to the dad as he was screaming profanities at our front door. We watched from the window as he gets into a seriously heated argument with them, to the point that they had to wrestle him to the ground before they detained him. This gave us an opportunity to talk to the cops ourselves, and as crazy as the whole situation was, we had to tell them the truth of the matter, that the dad had actually tried to run his kid over, which was basically attempted murder. Naturally, the cops agreed and arrested the guy, but not before asking him if he had in fact tried to run his own kid over. The guy's all like, "He's my son. My son. I'll raise him how I want, and if he doesn't do what I tell him, I'ma whip him." Basically confirming that he had tried to hit him with his truck. He was slurring his words the whole time, and it hit me at one point that this guy was pretty drunk from the way he was shouting and slurring at the cops. Definitely not a wise move on his part. And that was all the cops needed apparently, so they put him in the back of the patrol car and took him to jail. That was most definitely one of the craziest things that's ever happened to me. And I suppose it doesn't help the whole Florida man thing that a guy might try to run over his kid for not having taken a bath. I suppose given the behavior of his kid, that this might be more like a Florida men story or like a Florida family story, but I promise, not everyone here is totally crazy, no matter how much the media makes out that we're all just nuts. But saying that, since I moved out of state for college, it's definitely something that I've noticed about living further up in the East Coast. Sure, there's crazy people everywhere, but the concentration of crazies in Florida is definitely higher than most other places. I'm just glad the situation that night got resolved, and as weird as it was, the outcome was considerably more preferable to just watching a half-naked kid getting murdered by his own father. I'd much rather just smell some body odor than watch someone die. That's for certain. The history of humans keeping animals as pets is a rich and storied tale, with some archaeologists suggesting that human ownership of dogs as pets may date back to at least 12,000 years ago. There is physical evidence of the ancient Romans openly grieving for their cherished canine companions, with inscriptions and marble tombstones commemorating the life and death of a furry friend. Those who rode war horses into battle also developed a deep bond with their mounts, often becoming as famous as their owners, such as Alexander the Great's beloved Bucephalus. The ancient Egyptians were known to keep even more exotic animals such as lions or baboons as pets, and as time progressed, mankind's collection of animal companions only grew larger, stranger, and indisputably more deadly, culminating in one Florida man who would live to regret his choice of animal acquaintance in a big, big way. For 75-year-old Marvin Hayosh, the animal he chose to keep on his property just outside of Gainesville, Florida, was the cassowary. Cassowaries are large, omnivorous, flightless birds that are native to the tropical forests of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and northeastern Australia. They have an almost prehistoric appearance. Their bright blue faces are topped with a horn-like ridge, and their bodies are covered with dark feathers. At full sprint, they are capable of reaching speeds of up to 30 miles per hour and can use their powerful legs to jump up to 5 feet in the air. Adult females have been known to reach over 6.5 feet in height, weighing over 130 pounds, which makes them some fearsome feathered foes when angered. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the cassowary's physiology are their razor-sharp, 5-inch claws that adorn their 3-toed feet, eerily similar to that of the long-extinct velociraptor. The cassowary will throw kicks that bring those slashing claws across the face and throats of those that stray into their territory. These claws can inflict devastating, even fatal wounds, giving rise to its nickname of the world's most dangerous bird. So as insane as it may seem, it was this kind of animal that Marvin Hayosh adopted to keep as a pet. Marvin didn't just keep the cassowaries as pets, though. He also raised them and bred them, auctioning off the exotic birds as a way to make a living. So his property just outside of Gainesville was equipped with several large enclosures, mostly constructed right next to one another so that his beloved birds wouldn't get too lonely. Then on April the 12th, 2019, Marvin was undertaking one of the riskiest activities in his entire calendar. It was breeding season, and during that time of year, Marvin would have to make regular checks of his cassowaries' eggs, ensuring they were at the right temperature, of the right size and shape. But naturally, his cassowaries were extremely protective of their eggs, and would throw a fit every time Marvin ventured near them, attempting to rip him to shreds with their daggered claws through the bars of their cages. All was going well with the egg checks, until while moving between a narrow passageway between two enclosures, Marvin began to lose his footing. His foot dragged against fencing of one of the cages, causing him to crash into the dirt, winding him in the process. Marvin lay there for a moment catching his breath, but before he could bring himself to his feet, he felt an intense pain on the back of his neck. One of the cassowaries, boiling with rage that the man had just molested their beloved eggs, had rushed to the edge of the cage, stuck its leg through one of the narrow gaps in the fencing, and was using its razor-sharp claw to slash at Marvin's head, neck, and shoulder. Marvin tried to use his hand to cover himself, but the cassowary slashed them so deep that it exposed the bones in his fingers. He tried to bring himself to his feet, but the sheer force of the bird's blows sent him crashing down into the dirt again, and when he tried to crawl away down the long, narrow passageway, the cassowary simply followed him, sticking its legs through the gaps in the fencing as it continued its vicious, visceral attack. All Marvin could do was scream and scream and scream. A couple of ranch employees eventually heard his cries for help, but by the time they were able to scare the cassowary off of their employer and contact emergency services, the damage was already done. Marvin had more than a dozen lacerations across his face, neck, back, abdomen, thighs, legs, and right arm, including catastrophic damage to his brachial artery, the major blood vessel of the upper arm. Emergency workers rushed to try and retrieve his bleeding, dying body, but were unable to do so for quite some time as the cassowary that had attacked Marvin also tried to injure them too. In the end, Marvin was transported to a nearby hospital, but died of blood loss after being admitted. Paramedics found him unresponsive and barely breathing when they began treating him a mere 14 minutes after the attack was thought to have commenced. Twice over the next 28 minutes, as paramedics applied chest compressions, Marvin's pulse didn't register, and eventually it gave out altogether. Bill Grotchun, a representative of the medical examiner's office who headed up the investigation into Marvin's death, told news outlets that he had died from the trauma inflicted in the attack, calling it an unusual situation. "I've been doing this for 18 years, and I've never had a thing like this. I've had them killed by alligators and snakes, but never by a bird like that. I know ostriches and emus have their moments, but cassowaries are an extremely, extremely dangerous bird. You don't want to fool around with them. They have no sense of humor." The female cassowary, which is the larger of the two birds, saw he was messing with the eggs, and you know how that goes. It was like a mama bear protecting her young. But perhaps one of the most confusing things regarding the whole attack is the fact that the cassowary that killed Marvin was not put down, either during or after the incident. In fact, the very same bird was to be auctioned off as normal in order to pay for Marvin's funeral costs. The owner of Gulf Coast Livestock Auction in Madison, Florida, said the auction of the cassowary in question would be open to the public, but on Facebook they insisted that the news media would be excluded from the event and risk the destruction of their equipment if they attempted to document the proceedings. Jamie Wilson, the group's office manager, said that the Hayosh's family had asked them not to release any information to the news media. Miss Wilson said the group organized the auction of the bird, along with hundreds of other animals kept on the ranch, because Mr. Hayosh wanted them to be sold after his death. Elsewhere on the group's Facebook page, condolences poured in from the Hayosh family. A video posted there showed a man identified as Mr. Hayosh riding a camel in a gravel parking lot under a cloud sky in February of 2018, something one might typically expect of a Florida man. He was a great friend, the video's caption read. Even after the deadly attack, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission enacted no new rules or restrictions about owning cassowaries. If the animals are being used for commercial breeding, they are considered domestic animals and aren't required to have a permit. Only in the state of Florida, it seems, could a large and deadly bird be classed as a domestic animal in the same way a cat or dog would be. And it almost comes as no surprise that Florida man's choice of pet would be something distinctly related to one of the deadliest creatures to have ever walked the earth. A creature that's arguably put Joe Exotic's choice of furry friends to shame. But regardless, what happened to Marvin Hoyosh is a tragedy, and even with regards to the Florida Man meme, should not be taken lightly. May he and the rest of the Hoyosh family find some semblance of peace. What exactly is it that makes Florida Man act the way he does? What exactly causes him to commit some of the most bizarre, hilarious, and profane acts known to man, so much so that the entire concept has become internationally renowned? Is it the heat, the humidity, the close proximity to dangerous wildlife, or even wilder weather? It's a question that may never be answered, but what's clear is that a man certainly doesn't have to be born in Florida for that state's particular kind of madness to slip into their psyche. Which brings us to the case of the infamous Carl Tanzler. Carl Tanzler went by many names. Born on February 8, 1877 in Dresden, Germany, he was listed as George Tanzler on his German marriage certificate. Yet when he emigrated to the United States in 1926, he was listed as Carl Tanzler von Cosel, which some of his hospital records were signed Count Carl Tanzler. After a brief stop in Havana, Cuba, he settled in Zephyr Hills, Florida, where his sister had settled just a few years prior. In 1927, Carl was later joined by his family, consisting of his wife Doris and two young daughters, Ayesha and Clarissa. But Carl was unsatisfied in his married life, and later took a job as a radiology technician at the U.S. Marine Hospital in Key West, leaving his young family behind in Zephyr Hills. It was there he worked without incident for 3 years, until a young patient arrived at the hospital that changed his life forever. Ilana Milagro de Hoyos was a young Cuban-American woman who spent most of her life in Miami. But in April of 1930, Ilana complained of feeling unwell and, after seeing a doctor in Miami, was referred to the radiology department in Key West. Her appointment was scheduled for April 22nd, and it was that fateful day that brought her to first meeting with Carl Tanzler. The moment he laid eyes on her, Carl was smitten, and throughout the course of his initial examination of her, he found himself falling madly in love. Yet he was completely heartbroken to discover that Ilana was suffering from tuberculosis, a disease that was almost invariably fatal at the time of her diagnosis. Tanzler tried everything he could to save her life, using all of his medical knowledge along with a variety of treatments, medicines, X-ray, and electrical equipment, some of which he personally transported to Ilana's home. In the last days of her life, Carl showered Ilana with gifts. He brought her flowers, jewelry, clothes, and chocolates, each time declaring his undying love for her. It could have been the case that he believed that such affection would give her the will to fight her affliction, but his efforts, both personally and professionally, proved to be in vain. On October 25, 1931, Ilana de Hoyos died of tuberculosis at her parents' Key West home. Carl Tanzler paid for her funeral and then sought permission from her family to have a lavish above-ground mausoleum built in the Key West cemetery. The family was bemused by his unrequited adoration for their young daughter, but did not refuse the request. And so, Tanzler essentially had a shrine constructed to Ilana, one that he visited almost every night for 2 years, weeping openly at her gravesite as he mourned the loss of the love of his life. But Tanzler's love for Ilana, combined with his deep, boundless sense of loss, twisted and distorted his grief into something much darker. And in April of 1933, he made the decision to do something that would haunt Florida folklore for almost 100 years. In the dead of night, Tanzler crept through the Key West cemetery, pushing a small wooden wagon in front of him. He arrived at the mausoleum where Alana was interred and broke the seal on her tomb with a hammer and chisel. Undeterred by the stench of death that greeted him, Tanzler wrapped her body in a sheet, placed it on the cart, and then pushed it all the way back to his home. He was undoubtedly driven mad with grief, later saying that Alana's spirit would appear to him as he wept by her gravesite, singing her favorite Spanish language song to him before giving him permission to take her body from the grave so her spirit could occupy his home and be closer to him as a result. When he arrived home, Tanzler took Alana's skeleton and attached the bones together with piano wire. He had also taken the time to pick out a pair of glass eyes with irises of the same brown shade that Alana had, slotting them into her and gluing them into place. Since Alana's eyes had rotted away over the 2 years she had been buried, Tanzler went about replacing it, using a mix of silk cloth that had been soaked in plaster of Paris and wax. Somehow, Tanzler had also managed to collect a sizable amount of hair from Alana's mother. Although there are no records of exactly how he did this, he apparently had a large enough collection to be able to create an extremely lifelike wig out of it, which he then attached to Alana's lifeless skull. He also stuffed the corpse's chest and abdominal cavities with rags to maintain the integrity of her body's shape while in life. Once his amateur version of human taxidermy was completed, Tanzler dressed up his morbid project in some of the jewelry he had bought her, slid stockings onto the legs, and pulled gloves over the hands. He then applied a large amount of disinfectants, preserving agents, and perfume to slow the rate of decomposition and mask the rotten smell that emanated from his beloved Alana. When he was done, Tanzler took the body to bed with him. It wasn't long before employees at the Key West cemetery discovered that Alana de Hoyo's body was missing. They raised the alarm, telling police that the most likely culprit was Carl Tanzler. Yet Tanzler straight up denied the accusations, and despite being the main suspect in the corpse robbing, he managed to convince the investigating officers that he would be the last person to desecrate the lavish tomb he himself had paid so handsomely for. But as time went on, rumors abounded. Terrifying rumors that were only reinforced when a neighbor was said to have witnessed Tanzler dancing around his front room with an inanimate figure. It was instantly assumed to be the deceased Alana, and word soon reached her sister Florinda. It took her until October of 1940 to build up the courage to confront him. Tanzler arrogantly invited Florinda into his home, and after trying and failing to belay her concerns, she searched his house herself. She burst into his bedroom and was confronted with a scene of pure horror. The visage was rough, the form distorted, but the resemblance and the smell was enough to confirm her worst fears. The Tanzler had stolen her sister's body and reconstructed it in a sickening parody of her former self. She ran from the house and straight to the local police department, informing them that she had seen her sister's corpse in Tanzler's home with her own eyes. Police arrived at the property with a search warrant, arresting and detaining Tanzler when they too discovered the hauntingly morbid scene that greeted them in the bedroom. It was initially believed that he was simply insane, and therefore unfit to stand trial, but after a psychological examination, the heartbroken radiologist was found to be mentally competent and was subsequently charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without proper authorization. On October 8, 1940, a preliminary hearing was held at the Monroe County Courthouse in Key West. Tanzler faced the full set of charges, but unbelievably, they were completely dropped when Tanzler's lawyer correctly asserted that the statute of limitations for grave robbing had, in fact, expired, since the crime had been committed over 7 years prior. To the general public's deep shock and horror, Tanzler was released from custody. After the corpse was seized by the relevant authorities, physicians marveled at Tanzler's ad hoc attempt at amateur taxidermy. His methods were crude and shoddy, but somehow effective. However, they did make an alarming and disturbing discovery upon further examination of the corpse. There was evidence that Tanzler had committed necrophilia with Alana's body. 2 physicians, Dr. DePue and his colleague Dr. Foraker, who had attended the 1940 autopsy of Alana's remains, recalled in 1972 in an interview that a vaginal tube had been inserted into the pelvic region of the corpse, and pathologists made the bizarre decision to place the corpse on display at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home, where it was visited and viewed by several thousand morbidly curious Floridians. After a brief stint as an exhibit, Alana's body was eventually returned to Key West Cemetery, where, instead of being reinterred in the expensive, opulent mausoleum, it was buried in an unmarked grave, the location of which remained a closely guarded secret for many, many years to prevent Tanzler from stealing it again. And there's no doubt that, after putting in such hard work to restore his lost love, he would try once again to be reunited with her. The details surrounding the case made it perhaps the most infamous case of grave robbing that the modern world has ever seen. Publications such as the Miami Herald and the Key West Citizen obsessed over the story, pumping out headlines that generated a huge amount of interest in the state of Florida, as well as all over the rest of the United States. The general public was gripped by the ins and outs of such a sensational case, but bizarrely, instead of viewing Tanzler as the monster that he was, Americans mostly regarded him as something of an eccentric romantic. Later in 1944, Carl Tanzler relocated to Pasco County, close to his former home of Zephyr Hills, where his estranged wife Doris lived. It was there that in 1947 he wrote an autobiography, one that was commissioned for the pulp magazine Fantastic Adventures. The account of his morbid and perverted misadventures was his only source of income, since he could not find any medical work due to his infamy, and in his twilight years he was fully supported by his apparently forgiving wife. What's just as unbelievable is that, despite all he had done, 1950 saw Tanzler actually receive United States citizenship in Tampa. And what's more, Tanzler's obsession with Alana had not been sated. It was in Tampa that he used a death mask taken from Alana's face in the moments after her death to create a life-size recreation of his deceased lover, living with a woman-sized doll until his eventual death in 1952 at the ripe old age of 75. Some say that Tanzler's dead body was found wrapped up in the arms of his morbid creation, and that he died in the embrace of Alana's effigy, only too happy to join her in eternity. But there are some who even claim that Tanzler secretly had the bodies switched, so that when he passed away, he did so while in the grip of the real Alana's corpse. Regardless of the final truth of the matter, we can safely conclude that Carl Tanzler was a dangerously insane person, one that had showed no signs of madness until he had graced the shores of the Sunshine State. So as the question remains, what is it that makes a Florida man act the way he does? Perhaps in Carl Tanzler's case, it was something deep in the psychosphere that seeped into his consciousness, something that made a harmless infatuation morph into something truly disturbing and haunting. And perhaps it is this same toxic presence that continues to infect the minds of Florida's population, both male and female, even to this day. A few years back, my husband brought home one of those video doorbells from a local gadget store. We'd had some problems with porch pirates in our neighborhood here in Lake Worth, Florida, and we figured it'd help us to catch the culprits. The whole thing with the video doorbell was that as soon as anyone steps onto the porch, the built-in camera started to record. So basically anyone who came close enough to our front door would be caught on camera, and if our Amazon packages continued to get stolen, we'd have a clear image of whoever had taken them. Long story short, it worked. We caught the porch pirates on the doorbell cam, took the footage to the cops, and within a week we got in the news that they'd been arrested. It was a huge win for us. Those idiots had stolen almost $300 worth of stuff from us over the course of about 3 months or so, and it had caused a bunch of problems with Amazon before we figured out that the stuff was just being stolen. Point being, the doorbell cam was a huge success, and despite the hefty price tag, it was well worth the investment. But then last year, on Thursday morning of January 24th, I woke up to a notification on my phone. We were so pleased with our doorbell cam that we ended up getting a better model in late 2018, one which came with very interesting features. The camera came with an app you could download for free on the Google App Store, one which would beam live images from the camera direct to your phone or tablet. It also had a feature if you weren't able to open up the app to check out the live feed. It would make a little recording which you could then stream whenever you had the time to do so. It's a neat little feature, right? Well, I didn't think it was so neat that morning. The app was telling me that a video had been recording at around 6 a.m., one that was a good few minutes long. The last time it had done that was when the neighbor's cat was chilling on our porch for a while in the middle of the night, which was frankly amazing to wake up to, and had me and my husband like, aw, for a while when we woke up. Only this video was not so cute. I open it up and press play, and the first thing I see is this shadowy figure silhouetted on the porch. The doorbell cam emitted a certain amount of infrared light or whatever, so it could pick up directly what was in front of it, even in the dark, but the figure was just out of range of this, so all there I could see was this big old dark shape. But then the shape got nearer to the camera, closer and closer until a face was slowly illuminated by the infrared light. Those of you who know what a person's face looks like when it's lit up like that know how disturbing it can be, how inhuman that kind of light makes a person look. It makes light-colored eyes seem almost pale white, like they're undead or something. It just generally gives the person an ethereal, ghostly look. It looked like a ghost, but it was most definitely just a man. Not that it made the idea of him hanging around our porch any less creepy. This guy has this rough, scraggly beard, a bandana on his head, and was wearing what appeared to be a really dirty t-shirt. In his left hand, he had like a stack of mini newspapers or something, or maybe it was a phone book, I'm not completely sure. Whatever they were, at one point, he brought them up to his face and appeared to sniff them before moving in much closer to the camera, like darting close and away, over and over again. I had no idea what he was doing at first, until up at one point that he leaned in close to the camera and gave it a big old lick. Like, yes, he actually licked it, and it was absolutely disgusting. You could see right inside the guy's mouth how much slobber was on his tongue, and knowing this stuff ended up on my doorbell. Ugh, gross. He knew he was being recorded too. Like, as crazy as this guy was, he knew enough to realize that it was a doorbell cam, and must have some idea of how they functioned too, because after he's done licking the camera and assumedly the doorbell, the guy starts showing off the phone book or the newspapers, pointing to different words and stuff like he wanted us to read them. Then after a few more licks or kisses of the doorbell, he begins to walk away, with a string of drool just hanging from his chin. I mean, he was obviously high on something, but what exactly his drug of choice was, I have no idea. Maybe he was just drunk, I'll never truly know. But what I did know was that it was intensely creepy to know that he had been so close to me while I was asleep. Like, our house at the time was only kind of small, and the bedroom was pretty close to the main hallway and therefore the front door. If he'd really wanted to, he could have just bust open our bedroom window and have been in our bedroom in like a few seconds. I thank God he wasn't in a violent mood that night, or things could have been very, very different. But perhaps even weirder and probably pretty sad too is that when I showed my husband the video, he actually knew the guy. According to my husband, he used to live in the neighborhood and had lost his home there somehow and ended up on the street. Apparently he still came around the old homestead from time to time, looking at what he used to own, probably remembering a time when he was much happier and much safer. My husband knew his name too and said the guy asked him for a few cigarettes a few times, but he doesn't smoke, so all he could do was offer him a few dollars and some well wishes. The whole thing just pendulums between creepy and sad for me. Like, yeah, it's creepy that he was hanging around our house at night, but the other thing that really creeps me out is how he used to just be a regular guy. My husband said he was a family man, knew he at least used to have a wife and kids and a model little life at one time that just somehow went downhill. Maybe it was the drugs, a divorce that just fried his mental health at some point. Either way, at one time he was just like me and you, and I suppose the same thing could happen to any of us, given the right kinds of circumstances. And I think the very real prospects of a slip in mental health, a slide into drug addiction to ease the pain of heartbreak, that scares me more than any ghost or ghoul. I mean, we have no idea what's around the corner, so I try my best to count my blessings these days and to not take anything for granted, because you really don't know when you're going to lose things. You never truly know when it's your last time hugging a loved one or seeing a friend. You never know when that happiness is just going to slip away from you and never return. So back when I was a kid, growing up in Jacksonville in Florida, I used to do a lot of skateboarding. I sort of fell into it when my buddies started buying decks and getting into skate culture. I mean, it kind of comes as a whole package. All the clothes, the music, the attitude, and then if you're ballsy enough, then you actually get into the sport itself. And you do have to be ballsy because, Jesus Christ, does it hurt when you bail. Like after a while, you kind of learn how to fall properly, how to land in a way that doesn't break anything or roll as you hit the concrete so the shock of the impact doesn't do too much damage. But perhaps the biggest hazard that skating can bring is the random people who just take a disliking to you because you're doing it. Like to this day, it's still sort of a mystery to me as to why people used to take such objections to what was basically just a bunch of kids having fun in various parking lots and playgrounds. But still, it was a thing, a major thing, and more than once it caused us a lot of trouble. But without a shadow of a doubt, the worst time was an encounter with someone I can only describe as the archetypical Florida man. I mean, he looked like Dog the Bounty Hunter's mentally ill cousin, only instead of dressing like a cool lawman, he wore flip-flops, an American flag wife-beater, and a pair of tiny denim shorts that would have put Daisy Duke to shame. We were skating in an empty section of a strip mall parking lot one Saturday afternoon, just doing our usual thing of trying to master our ollies and attempt the old kickflip. The entire parking lot was mostly empty, and anyone who drove into it tended to park well away from us, just out of courtesy, I suppose. But Dog's cousin drives his truck all the way down the empty lot, just to park up right next to us, right in the way of where we were trying to skate. We can immediately sense the passive-aggressive nature of this, and it puts on a damper on the whole mood. One moment we're all nailing our ollies, the next we're just stood there in line, decks in hand, watching this guy back his truck into a parking space. The guy then gets out, stares us down, and says something like, "You know you kids can't do that here." We argue back a little. The guy curses us out, then walks off to pick something up from one of the stores at the strip mall. There's a little more in the way of dirty looks and cursing when he walks back to his truck, but after he drives off, we're back to enjoying ourselves. Then like half an hour later, we see the same truck pulling into the parking lot again, only this time, we can really sense a confrontation coming. The dude doesn't bother pulling into a space this time, though. Dog's cousin jumps out after stopping his truck, like, directly in front of us. He's cursing us out even harsher than last time, telling us he's about to teach us a lesson in respect and all this other boomer stuff. Then he walks to the back seat of his truck, pulls them open, and we start getting ready to run, thinking he's about to pull out some kind of weapon or something, which he kind of did. Only it most definitely wasn't the kind of weapon we were expecting. Because out of the back seat of his car, he pulls out a freaking gator. Yup, a North American alligator. He's walking towards us with this thing in his arms like it wasn't huge, but it was a gator. I don't care how big it was. Anything larger than a baby scares the life out of me, and then he's like putting his hand on the muzzle that was sealing that thing's mouth shut, like he's ready to whip it off and just hurl the gator right at us. We obviously didn't stick around to find out. But only in Florida can a guy just drive around with a gator in the backseat of his truck. And only in Florida is a gator classed as a freaking melee weapon. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. and join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and see you later, alligators.